moving forward, one note that I am just so excited about, and really all fantasy fans should be, is Derrick Henry going to the Ravens, a match made in fantasy heaven, as I like to call it. I wrote about this one this week. You can find that at RotoStreetJournal.com. But yeah, age 30, I get it. The cliff for running backs. We're betting on an outlier here if he's actually going to hit big, because age 30 running backs never do, right? Well, who's a bigger outlier than the human steamroller named Derrick Henry, who last year proved he still has it, running behind the worst line of Pro Football Focus's grades last year. Ultimately, still ripped off the second most yards, 1,167. Yards after contact was second as well, 857. And also the second most explosive runs, 15 plus yards, 16 total there. And he hit the fourth highest max speed among running backs, ahead of Keaton Mitchell, Jahmyr Gibbs, Kenneth Walker. He had 5 total plays of 20 miles per hour. That was only behind Breece Hall and Devon Achane there. The King still has it. And now he's going into the most fertile rushing environment you could possibly ask for. First, third, seventh, and first in total rush attempts. That's 4 of the last 6 seasons. Number 1 in rush attempts have the Ravens been in, only below top 3 once. And they've been top 3 in rushing yards for all 6 of the years in that span. And no, Derrick Henry's been the number 1 rusher or number 2 rusher in all 6 of those years in yards per game. He is just an animal. This is a perfect rushing environment. 19 rush attempts inside the 5 for Gus Edwards. He turned those into 13 touchdowns, third among running backs. This, to me, I just could keep going on and about how perfect this situation is for Derrick Henry to go off. He's up into my top 10 running backs, though. I know he's 30, though, Mike. Am I going crazy, or do you consider this a just dream spot as well?
Everyone always likes to talk about that age 30 threshold when it comes to running back, about how they fall off the cliff, but I think it's just time we start. People have been talking about this the last 2 off seasons. I think it's time that we start not considering Derrick Henry as one of those typical running backs. Everyone knows just physically he's a mold breaker, and I just, like, in terms of his longevity, I don't know why he can't be the same thing. Obviously, it's scary just given the age, but we've seen it. He's consistently played behind, not consistently, but over the last few years, he's played behind one of the worst offensive lines in footballs and continues to produce. And now you talked about how he's getting that upgrade. I know you talked about Gus Edwards, but the Ravens running back room as a whole, 28 attempts from inside the 5 last year, converted into 15 touchdowns. And I think the expectations for Henry are pretty solid. I think he'll see similar usage to what he did in Tennessee last year. He'll handle the vast majority of the rushing work with limited receiving work. I believe he had 28 receptions last year, and he has rarely cracked that 30 reception threshold throughout his career, and I don't think he will this year. But
yeah, that was the second highest of his career last year at like 27. Not great. And Lamar doesn't like to throw those running backs. We know what we're getting. We're not getting receiving boosts here. But it's just a monster on the ground.
1,200 to 1,300 yards on the ground with 12-ish touchdowns. I think that's very much within the range of outcomes. And if you're drafting him as your second running back, I know you said you have him inside your top 10, but I feel like once we get down to it, I think he'll be drafted as a high-end RB2. I think he can provide solid output as your second running back drafted.
Yeah, and you'll see when we draft too. And I don't know if you've done any since we last drafted. Before landing with the Ravens, he was going around 50 to 60 range. I scooped him up in 20% of my drafts ahead of time. He's now going top 30, and I don't think it's necessarily wrong by any means, but it's just one of the biggest risers for sure since the last time we drafted here, landing in that pristine spot. And I know he said 12-ish touchdowns. I think so, but if Gus Edwards can put up 13, I mean, if Henry put up 20 touchdowns next year, I don't think anyone would be shocked either. Like, there is that ceiling, which is, I know Lamar runs at the goal line some too, and I get it, but like, there is 20 touchdown upside here. The guy is, it's perfect. I absolutely love this fit despite the 30-year-old risk. Joe Mixon of the Texans. I know you had a ton to say on this, and I just said a ton about Derrick Henry. So I'll take a breather, let you take the lead on this one, and give my thoughts at the end. What do you think about landing with the Texans? A volume back, top 10 offense? Seems like a solid fit to me. What's the gut reaction for you?
I'm interested just because of the CJ Stroud-led offense. We saw what they can do last year, and I think that there's nowhere to go but up. Well, nowhere to go but up, but I think they're going to continue to progress as a team with those young receivers and Nico Collins and Tank Dell with CJ Stroud at the helm. Mixon should be provided with plenty of opportunities, sustained drives from CJ Stroud, and plenty of opportunities at the goal line to punch it in. So the environment's great, but the real question is Joe Mixon still effective? He had a strong overall stat line last season, just over 1,400 total yards, 52 catches, 12 touchdowns, and he was the RB11 in fantasy points per game last year. But he did this on the back of high volume. He basically ran the Bengals backfield last year. He was 5th in raw rush attempts, 1st in team rush share percentage. He handled 67% of all carries for the Bengals, not just the running back carries. He handled 2/3 of all the carries. That was the highest in the league, higher than Christian McCaffrey, higher than anyone else. 13th in raw targets, 15th in target share, and 3rd in goal line carry share. He handled 84% of Cincinnati's carries inside the 5-yard line. And that's not what I think he's going to be seeing next season. I don't think the Texans did sign him to a 3-year, $27 million deal last year, but the usage that Joe Mixon saw with Cincinnati last year, I think, was reflective on with them not trusting Chase Brown. I think they wanted to get someone in the mix, but they just didn't trust Chase Brown enough, especially in pass protection. And we'll touch a little bit that on later when we talk about Zack Moss and Chase Brown. But I just don't think he's going to see that volume, but I think he could get there on just because he's playing on such a great offense. And you kind of can tell that he's not the same guy anymore just based on his efficiency metrics from last season. His 2.43 yards after contact per attempt, 37th among all running backs with at least 100 carries. And he wasn't particularly explosive last year. Not many big plays, 36th in explosive run rate among all running backs with at least 100 carries last year. So if he's going to get there as a productive fantasy guy, it'll be on the back of high volume. And with the passing forward offense of the Texans, I'm just not sure if all that volume is going to be there.
I think it's a fair point. Yes, it's definitely going to be a pass happier offense. I just also look at that, though, and I see Mixon played 78% of the 2-minute offense with Cincinnati, had 11% target share. Not insane, but certainly not nothing either. And Dameon Pierce is the only other guy on this roster. So, yeah, maybe the raw total of snaps and volume won't necessarily be quite as high as Cincy. But I do think in terms of about 60% of the workload here, 65, 70%, I don't think Pierce is eaten in, certainly not into the receiving work and probably not into the carry share. He did nothing last year. And we saw them finally turn the keys over to Devin Singletary when Pierce got hurt. It was 76, 80%, 87%, 81%. We saw a 30 carry game out of Devin Singletary last year, in addition to 2 targets in that game, a 22 carry game, a 26 carry game. Once they decided to finally ride him and multiple 21, 23, 19.8, multiple top 10 performances when they decided to finally just turn the keys over. And this was, again, Devin Singletary. And yeah, you said Mixon wasn't that efficient. I totally get that too. But if Devin Singletary can have multiple top 10 performances within this offense once he was finally ridden, I do think 270 touches in a top 10 scoring offense, 23.4 points per game last year, probably take it another step forward. Even if he's not that efficient, and Dwayne McFarland did a great study about this offseason, that like efficiency metrics are awesome to paint the overall talent picture, but ultimately volume and snap share and receptions and targets, that's the king at running back. And I just see 270-ish touches coming Joe Mixon's way, even at an older, more inefficient level. So be it. I think he's going to still be a very, very solid running back too. He hasn't been outside the top 12 running backs in 6 years now. I don't know that he's going to fall out this year. I think this is a perfect landing spot for him for sure.
I think it just comes down to whether or not it's a volume-driven position. I think it comes down to whether or not you think he's going to hit that 270 to 300 touch threshold. And if he does, he'll get there. I 100% agree. I'm just, with him getting up there in age and just like dropping off in the efficiency, I'm just not sure if he's going to be that bell cow just because he just won't be as effective. But we'll see. Yeah, they did ride Devin Singletary when it was working last year. So, there's definitely plenty of outcomes where he finishes with 270 touches. We'll just have to see. So
yeah, well, as you mentioned, he does leave behind a massive opportunity over in Cincinnati. 257 carries, 66 targets, top 10 in opportunities. And you mentioned so many of the metrics in terms of the most carries per backfield, all that good stuff, especially in the red zone too. 3rd for inside the 20 carries, 1st for inside the 10 carries, and 3rd for inside the 5. Tons of volume in the red zone now vacated. And who's going to gobble it up? Well, maybe Zack Moss, who has been signed on a 2-year, $8 million deal. I wrote about this one on the website as well, so I'll just quickly touch upon some of my key points there. In Taylor's absence from weeks 2 to 5, Moss was the every down back. He shouldered 80% or more of the snaps for all 4 of those weeks. He tallied 89 carries, 517 yards from scrimmage, and 4 total touchdowns, making him the running back 4 at an average of 20.4 fantasy points per game in that 4-week span. Small sample size, yes, but it definitely was far more than I had ever expected or seen from Zack Moss in his career. And so that definitely has me intrigued in that Joe Mixon-ish role. I do think Chase Brown is going to mix into those passing down situations. He does have to improve in pass protection. You mentioned that, but I think that was part of why he started to get onto the field by the end of the season, is his coaches noted that he had improved there. Now, Brown is a game breaker, 9.81 RAS score, relative athletic score, 35th out of 1,745 running backs since 1980. And he also flashed that on the field with a 22.5 miles per hour catch on a 54-yard receiving touchdown. That's the second fastest ball speed of the year. So this is an explosive athlete here that between the two, if you knew Chase Brown and Moss were splitting at 50-50, Chase Brown then would become the immediate must pick. But I do think Moss, especially that red zone volume we talked about, will be inheriting a ton of that 10 to 12 touchdown upside for Moss, in addition to 800 to 1,000 on the ground. I also do think, though, Chase Brown could also probably rack himself up 70 to 100 touches, with 50 or so of them being receptions, given how much they have leaned upon Mixon in the running back receiving room. I do think if Brown inherits that, he could have himself a monster year too. I do rank Moss higher just because I do think that's the sturdier, more consistent role. But as we're going to get into best ball in a little bit, some of those explosive games could come from Chase Brown. And Moss had missed time every year in Buffalo before going over to Indy as well. So we're looking at like the ultimate handcuff with benefits there in Chase Brown as well. Because if he becomes the starter, he is 210. Like, he's not this tiny pipsqueak that I think a lot of people think he is. Brown's got some girth to his smaller frame. I like Chase Brown too. So I think this is a win-win for both Moss and Chase Brown. Both, especially Moss, rose up my rankings to a huge, huge degree. But I don't mind taking both of them in drafts. I think they're both great values because I don't think Moss's price reflects just how valuable this role is going to be, given he was going at pick 150 not too long ago. Now he's in like the 90s. I think he should be going in the 70s, maybe even 60s. This is a very valuable spot. So I think both of these guys are great values right now. Moss preferred, Chase Brown not too far behind, though. Do you think any holes to poke in any of that?
Not really. I really just think that Chase Brown's role really will come down to how much he's improved in pass protection last year, because I think that they wanted to get Chase Brown on the field last year. They just couldn't justify it given how much of a problem that he was in pass protection. So I agree with you. We're on the same page that Moss will be the primary rusher. He'll handle all the groundwork, and I think that will lead to him initially, at least, getting the red zone opportunities. But I think they'll give Chase Brown his opportunities, and if he can prove that he's capable of pass protecting and then doing something with the ball when it gets passed to him or handed off to him, I think he'll carve out a solid role. So I think they're both worth snatching up in drafts, especially before – I agree. I think their prices will come up. So snatching them up now before their prices come up too much, I think is a good idea.
Absolutely. Well, backfield notes continue to pour in here, and Aaron Jones, landing with division rival, woke up and chose revenge, as Ian Hartett said in his tweet. And I love it. He already mentioned, I don't even know what's going on in Green Bay anymore. Now I'm focused on Minnesota. You know he's going to be fired up for those games. That's the type of player Aaron Jones is. I cannot wait for him to get that crack at it. But he is also now leaving a Packers offense that was completely on the rise. You know, you wrote about it, multiple 30-plus point days in their last half of the year, averaging right around 28 points per game. We're a top 5 scoring offense for once Jordan Love really started to take off. He was actually the quarterback too in fantasy. So this was a great environment. I was very excited to see what Jones could do, especially after he topped out at 130 yards from scrimmage in 4 straight games to close out the year. I was very excited to see how this can continue. Now he goes over to Minnesota, and if Kirk Cousins was there, great. Like, this could have been a great environment for Aaron Jones to thrive. It seems like they're going to make some moves at quarterback still, but as we look at it today, Sam Darnold's at the top, and that worries me. What's your take on Aaron Jones landing in Minnesota? I've got a few other numbers I'd like to toss out there, but I want to hear your gut reaction too.
I am also incredibly worried about Aaron Jones heading to Minnesota. So you talked about a little bit how he closed out last season. His season last year was interesting. It was pretty heavily impacted by injury. He was dealing with MCL injury and a hamstring injury, and he only played 11 games, but he closed out strong, like you mentioned, with 130-plus scrimmage yards in 4 straight games, but he was also doing that on 20 to 25 touches in all of those games. I don't think he's going to be seeing that in Minnesota, but I also don't think anyone was expecting him to have 130 scrimmage yards in every game with Minnesota. No. But Jones still proved to be effective when he was on the field, especially as a pass catcher. He was top 12 in both yards per route run and target per route run among running backs. So I think he's going to be – I think the Vikings understand what he can bring to them through the air. But I just don't like this fit in Minnesota whatsoever. They had little success running the ball last year. They were in the bottom of half of the league in all of these statistical categories: rush attempts, rush rate over expectation, rushing yards per game, yards before contact. And it's just, you saw it last year. Nobody could really get it going except for a couple games here and there between Alexander Madison and Ty Chandler. And like you mentioned, the potential of Sam Darnold or maybe J.J. McCarthy, whoever is going to be that quarterback, just makes the outlook that much more cloudy. So it's concerning in that sense, but there is some positives to this. I mean, he signed a $7 million contract, so he's clearly going to be the top option in Minnesota. He'll be the second top running back option in Minnesota. He'll be the secondary offensive option along with Addison behind Justin Jefferson. And I think you can expect 15 to 20 touches a game, which should be enough for him to produce. And I think he'll produce like a low-end RB2, and that'll be solid production. But the offensive environment and their struggles to run the ball as a team are problematic for me. And I want to be excited about Aaron Jones because I still think he has some in the tank, and I still think the price is good. But the inability of the Vikings to run the ball over the last few years and the question marks surrounding the offensive environment in general are having me a little hesitant right now.
Yeah, you mentioned 15 to 20 touches a week. Well, in his career, when Jones sees 14 or more carries, just carries in a game, that's happened 33 times in his career. He's averaged 21.8 fantasy points per game, was on pace for 1,731 rush yards, 439 receiving yards as well, and 16 total touchdowns in that pace. But as mentioned, that was with the Packers, a much more different situation there. Sam Darnold's points per game, his offense is a very 23rd his rookie year, then 31st, 32nd, and 29th, all topping out at 17.3, 15.2, and 17.9 points per game as a total offense. So if it is Darnold at quarterback, I will be much more concerned, but maybe they are getting the ammunition to move up, to get a Drake May, to get a Jaden McDaniels, then I might feel a lot better about this. But I do have questions about Jones now also approaching 30 and all those running game statistics you cited for the Minnesota Vikings. It just seems like it should be a better fit than it actually is. I am worried. I'm not drafting him much at his price right now. One other running back, and the last running back we are talking about today that ultimately I am not drafting, wasn't drafting, and now certainly not drafting in his new home is Austin Ekeler going to the Commanders. And I hate saying that because Ekeler has been one of my fantasy guys for the last 5 years. I've loved the guy. And maybe he's already said it himself in his press game, his presser, was that he wanted to come here because Brian Robinson can be that big carry guy, wear down the defense just like Melvin Gordon used to do, and then it allows Ekeler to go out and do his thing. He had some really, really productive years in that type of role, and who was the offensive coordinator at that time was Anthony Lynn, now his running back coach over there with the Commanders. So it is probably going to be this type of thunder lightning committee. We're talking about an Ekeler career high of 206 carries. It's not like he was going to ever be at bell cow type of guy going to the Cowboys or anything like that anyways. Yet it's still the Commanders. And sure, maybe Daniels can spark this and the offense. I like Kingsbury. I do. I actually am one of the few people that think he can scheme a solid offense. And he's definitely used running backs really, really well. Is why I was so excited for Brian Robinson to be that lead back there. But now in a likely committee, Kingsbury, again, his running backs over the careers, you look at Kenyon Drake, you look at James Conner, have routinely been top 5 in total touchdowns for the year, but now it might just be a little bit more split up there between Robinson and Ekeler. It certainly is a downgrade as well for Brian Robinson having another backfield mouth to feed. It seemed like he might have that receiving role potentially elevated, and certainly not now with a more souped up Antonio Gibson. So I just keep thinking of it, and they're going at like 90 to 100 range anyway. So I guess like in that range, maybe it's time to take a stab, but I haven't felt the need to. James Conner is still sitting there. Other guys that I like to draft instead over the split gross backfield. So my gut reaction is gross. I don't know. What do you think, Mike?
I think that the Austin Ekeler move in and of itself isn't really moving the needle for a lot of people. I think basically everyone jumped on the Austin Ekeler is taking a step back wagon. They kind of want, if you want to call him washed, you can. But I think everyone can agree that he's definitely taken a significant step back from what he used to be. But what I'm more interested here is buying the dip on Brian Robinson. He's never really had a pass catching role with the Commanders. It's never been a part of his game. So everyone was drafting him highly in hopes that he might. Now we know we don't. Now we know that he won't have that pass catching role. I'm interested in buying the dip. I still think he's going to get fed as a ball carrier. I don't like you mentioned, I don't think Ekeler wants to be carrying the ball that often. I think he wants to get out in space, be catching the ball. And with the ability to still be controlling the majority of the rushing work in Washington, I think he can still provide some value as a running back on your roster. I know with a rookie quarterback coming in, whoever that ends up being, well, it might not be the best situation in terms of the offensive environment to start the year, but he's going to be handling the vast majority of carries for this team. So he's going right around pick 100 right now. I'm still interested. I know it's not really a sexy pick, but he's never really had this receiving role, and he's still produced as a fantasy asset. So I don't see why not get him here and there around pick 100, especially if he's falling.
Yeah, he was the running back 21 last year, going right now like running back 30 or plus right now for Brian Robinson. So I still think, yeah, I do think there's some value to buying that dip. And who knows if Ekeler is completely washed. It's one of those things we all have seen that carry where he's facing the Packers. He hit like 13 miles per hour, looked like he was running in mud. Ekeler did hit 18 miles per hour in week one, had, a 25 fantasy point day. So there could still be some juice, and maybe he was just playing through injury as well. I don't know. I guess the dip on Brian Robinson, if it goes low enough, but he's still going around guys I just like more, that intrigue me more from the backfields or receiver positions. So we will see when we draft, and we'll see where Brian Robinson ends up falling, because I'm not opposed to him. I like the player. I love the toughness. I think Dan Quinn's going to gravitate to that type of presence too. We shall see. What is up, you fantasy wolf? Thanks so much for tuning in. If you haven't already, share your thoughts in the comments, check out some more videos, and join the newest Wolfpack by subscribing below.